Welcome, everyone, to our series, Wellbeing at Work. It's a podcast series that's brought to you by the Center for Organizational Effectiveness at Workplace Options. Today, we're talking about beyond the surface of occupational health, the interrelationship between psychological and physical risks. The series is dedicated to exploring the many dimensions of employees' well-being and the evolving practices that help organizations support a thriving workplace. Today, I'm honored to be joined by my colleague, Jonathan Gawthorpe, Executive Director of Safety, Quality, and Risk at EMCOR UK. EMCOR UK is a leading facilities management company, and Jonathan is also an expert and a fellow of the Institute of Leadership and the International Institute of Risk and Safety Management. His unique perspective blends operational risk management and psychological well-being, making this a timely and important conversation for today's workplaces. Jonathan, thank you so much for being here. It's a pleasure to be talking with you today.
Mary-Ellen, thank you very much indeed for the opportunity to speak with you. I'm very much looking forward to our conversation together.
Great. So let's start off today by grounding the discussion in some definitions. We hear a lot of terms being thrown around about psychosocial risk, physical risk, psychological hazards. And what we'd like our audience to know today is really, what do we mean by the psychological and physical risk in the context of a workplace?
Sure. And I think your summary shows what a bit of a minefield it can be. There's a lot of technical language going on in there. So I'll try and simplify it, if I may. So in terms of the psychological risk, I see it very much split into kind of three areas. So first of all, we've got demands and controls, so work demands and the opportunity for individuals to control those demands. We've got then support and relationships in the workplace. And then thirdly, the roles that one performs and also change during the course of one's employment. So those are the kind of three macro areas. And then within that, I guess we've got some areas of activity which can have a psychological effect. So, for example, conflict, lone and remote work, shift work, the impact of communications, good communication and not so good communication, and as I've mentioned, change management is a kind of omnipresent hazard within organisations. So that's that kind of psychological capture. And then obviously in terms of physical, that's perhaps a little bit more obvious and a bit more traditionally wedded to the health and safety agenda that most people will know about. And we'll talk a little more about that as we go through, I'm sure.
Thanks so much for that context, Jonathan. It really helps to clarify how we frame the risks in today's work environment. Next, I'd like to ask you to share some of your real-world examples where psychological and physical risks were clearly interlinked.
Yeah, sure. And I think I've got three live examples here, really. So one is around, and I've mentioned shift work already. One is around shift work and obviously fatigue that can come along with that, and the breakup of individuals' kind of circadian rhythms and so on and so forth that can really have an effect on individuals from a psychological perspective, but obviously then from a physical perspective in terms of that, being tired and fatigued within the workplace. The second one that I think about is in the kind of travel space. So when people are working remotely, be it that they are traveling for work, or whether or not they are traveling to get to work on a, fairly long commute. And what can happen there, of course, is that individuals' behaviours around looking after their personal health can be impacted. And that could be as simple as, if you've got a long commute, not having time to have a regular exercise regime, for example, right the way to the other end of the spectrum, when you've got people who are regularly staying away from home in hotels, for example, and then they're not necessarily looking after themselves. They're not getting a good night's rest, because we all know we probably don't sleep as well in a hotel as we might do at home. So there are some real effects to think about there. And then I guess the last one is around change. I've spoken about that already briefly. Change management will mean that people are constantly thinking about their part in the process, what might happen to them as a result of changes that are taking place. That can lead to distraction, and distraction can lead to a physical incident taking place, a physical accident taking place. And so again, there's a real linkage there between both the psychological hazards and physical outcomes as a result.
Thank you for that. I think those are three very strong illustrations that many of us face all the time, understanding how that linkage occurs. Now, let's shift a little bit more to the more proactive side of things. Can you share with us some best practices in integrating mental health and physical safety strategies in the workplace?
I think there's a very straightforward go-to here that I would like to signpost, and that is the ISO standards for occupational health and safety, which is ISO 45001, and then the standard for the management of occupational psychological health in the workplace, which is ISO 45003. And the reason I signpost those is because a lot of organizations who are already doing good work in the more traditional health and safety space will very much recognize the framework of ISO 45003, which is about the management of psychosocial hazards. Some of those things I've talked to already. So there's a recognition, I think, by organizations if you start to introduce 45003, and the merging of the two together really does enable a whole person approach to safety, to looking after both the physical and the mental health of our teams in the workplace. So I think that's a really nice place to start. Another area, and again, it's another kind of model or framework that one can consider, is looking at how an organization might adopt the hierarchy of control methodology. So again, well established in the physical safety space. There is a model which was produced in 2014 by Le Montagne and his team, and they produced a psychological hierarchy of control, which starts again with elimination, so removing any of those antecedents to poor mental health and well-being, through to redesigning the work and adjusting the work. And then it looks at also employee responsibilities in terms of educating employees. So that's, I suppose, playing into that personal resilience space, but also how one might encourage employees to take personal accountability. So if we think about that in the context of my earlier answer and travel and having good behaviours in travel, it should be incumbent upon the employer to really educate and support employees who find themselves in that position, to enable them to make the right decisions. So those are two quite nice frameworks which I think really integrate both physical and psychological health in the workplace.
Yeah, that integrated approach and the way you speak about that sounds like it can make a really big difference in organizations. But I'm thinking, what happens when the physical risks go unaddressed? Like, how does psychological distress increase the physical risks on the job?
Yes, I think if I'm understanding your question correctly, I think one does naturally lead into the other. So again, if whichever way you address it, they impact. It's almost like a virtuous circle. If we take and start with, the psychological hazards and somebody feeling psychologically unsafe in the workplace for, let's take change management as being the reason, then I guess I've already outlined how that can lead to distraction in a heavy industry environment, for example. That's really not a good mindset to be operating in, and has every potential then to lead to an undesirable outcome. Conversely, if we do it we look at it from the other perspective, and we say we start with something that's a physical risk. If people are feeling unsafe in the workplace because of the work that they are doing, and are being, in their view, exposed to specific hazards in the workplace, that will undoubtedly have a detrimental effect in terms of their psychology and how they're feeling generally about being in that workplace. And more often than not, we'll find that people will either not be operating at their optimum, or more likely that they're taking time away from the workplace because they don't actually want to be there. And I think therefore whilst one can divorce the two in respect of the antecedents to them, what you can't do is divorce them in terms of their connectivity, because fundamentally we are physical and mental beings, and therefore they're relevant whichever one you start with.
Right. Yeah, I appreciate what you said, especially about if you're divorcing them, because I think, in our field at Workplace Options, I think where we're at around looking at the physical and the psychological risks, we're feeling almost that we're playing catch up on the psychological risk side, because there has been so much emphasis on the physical risk, how to identify them, how to manage them. And I think what we're seeing now is sort of some new thinking, bringing that interconnection together. And at this point, I think, given the ripple effect that you've discussed, it leads us to kind of looking at leadership, and, setting priorities in an organization. So I think those of us in the field can see that interconnection. But now we're kind of looking at what role do leaders and managers play in recognizing and addressing these dual risks. And I think you identified a little bit of that when you talked about the hierarchy of control. But could you speak a little bit more to, leadership and their role in recognizing and addressing these dual risks?
Yeah, I think that there's two parts to that. I think so in recognizing it, if I just put that to one side for a moment, I think in terms of managing, somebody once said to me, as a leader in an organization, remember the shadow that you cast. And I think that's a really nice statement to consider this question against, because as a leader, one has a responsibility first and foremost to get to understand the teams, how they like to work, both as an individual and as a group together, and then to enable both at an individual level and at a group level, that team or those teams to be able to do their best work. That fundamentally is the role of a leader, whatever the specific function is, whether it's an engineering function or whether it's a health and safety function, the role of the leader is exactly the same role. So I think taking that as a start point, if we understand that that's the role that we are in as a leader, there is then also, I believe, a responsibility to have a level of understanding about the type of things that can impact both at an individual and at a group level. And those are the things, I guess, that I talked about in terms of those three areas: the demand and the control, the autonomy, the job role. Is it precise enough? Is the job description that one has actually the job that we are being asked to do? And are the goals smart and Are we getting feedback on our goals and our performance? The relationship that we have with individuals. So, as I say, getting to know at an individual level, both from a personal and a professional perspective, has got to be the goal of every good leader in this space. And then understanding the impact of having change. And I think, goodness me, in this day and age, the only constant that we have is change. And I think being skilled at recognizing that can have both a positive and a negative impact on individuals is absolutely core to what being a leader is in 2025 and beyond. I also think something that perhaps I haven't spoken to yet is around recognizing from an inclusivity point of view the different demographics within an organization, and never more so than now, both in terms of age demographic and also the impact of technology that is incoming, and also the responsibility that we have as purposeful organizations to recognize the differences in our populations and reflect that in our teams. And that comes with a skill set as a leader as well, being able to ensure that it's fair and equitable and a psychologically safe environment is absolutely at the top of, or should be at the top, should I say, of every leader's agenda. And all of those things are interconnected to this conversation from a psychological point of view, and getting that right will then lead into having a physically well formed workforce as well, of course, as we've already alluded to. So for me, leadership is absolutely critical to this discussion.
I couldn't agree more. And thank you for articulating it in the way that you have. I think that's going to give everyone a lot of food for thought as they think about their own organizations. I'm imagining, though, that the connection between this psychological and physical safety might look different depending on the sector. Are there any industries where this interrelationship is more pronounced than others, or that we can look to as examples as we explore this further?
It's interesting, actually. So I did some research myself a few years ago, and it was in a particularly heavy industry arena, and there was an absolute connectivity between the psychological safety of individuals in that space and the physical outcomes of the work that they were doing. And what was quite interesting, this was a phenomenological study, so it looked at the lived experience of employees in that space. And it was very clear that there was a kind of hierarchy of, in this particular environment, of managers who physically sat on the top floor of the factory setting, whilst the guys who were doing the heavy labouring, and it was heavy labouring, were almost kind of down in the cellar, doing the work that they were doing, and never the twain shall meet. And I think that in that study it showed that individuals were negatively impacted from a psychological point of view, and that negative psychology meant that they were then physically becoming injured during their work because they were tired, they were misdirected, they were not happy in the work that they were undertaking, and all of these things were a bit of a downward spiral, to the point where one of the individuals actually coined the phrase of the research paper, which was being a hidden part of the machine, which I thought was quite telling in its own way. So I think that heavy industry space can be quite demanding, both mentally and physically, and is something that stands out for me. I think another area is one, and I've mentioned the travel, but I think remote working any environment, working environment that includes people who may be working on their own or working away from an office hub or a building hub, that can have quite significant psychological effect around connectivity. If we think back to the first question, and one of the responses to that was around the importance of relationships, that becomes increasingly challenged when one is not directly connected with your line manager or with teams. And so I think that's another area that lends itself to standing out. And then I think shift work is also an area where individuals are affected by fatigue. They're affected by the lack of the availability of routine and consistency. All of those things can be significant impactors on individuals' physical and mental health in the workplace.
Wow, thank you for that. I mean, I think you've given us a lot more concrete thoughts to take away and to kind of relate to our own situations. So thank you for that insight. Jonathan, before we wrap up, I'd love to hear a little bit more of your perspective on the big picture. You've had vast experience in this field and you've worked with a number of different organizations. What is one thing that you wish every employer knew about that connection that would encourage them to take action and take it to the next step?
Do you know, I think the thing that would really work is that individuals, leaders, organizations understand that it exists. It's real. And I think there's been a little bit of backwards and forwards over time with people kind of challenging that particular concept and wanting to stay in their lane, perhaps, in terms of we're health and safety and we're looking after the physicality of individuals, and that's our responsibility. And then over here on the other side, you might have, human resources, for example, who are saying, well, we're looking after the well-being and the mental health of people. The whole thing needs to be merged together. So for me, it's about understanding that it exists and recognizing the need for partnership laterally across the organization to ensure that everybody is doing the same thing for everybody all of the time. I think consistency is key. There's a really nice quote actually from Dana and Griffin, which goes back to 1999, where they talk about occupational health is an employee's state of mental, general, physical health and well-being. And I think we knew it then. This isn't new, but it is to the fore, I think, because of organizations recognizing that they need to be something different to perhaps what they've been in the past. And therefore, the opportunity to set oneself up to be a really great employer brings a whole lot of benefit, not only from a moral, ethical, and in some countries legal responsibility perspective, but to be an employer of choice. I mean, it's an employee's market, right? Everybody's going after the same pool of individuals. So if you want an attractiveness factor that's going to set you up and a USP that's going to set you up as an employer, why not be this? Why not be an organization that is so good to its spoke, that understands what makes people tick and is genuinely curious and interested? And my goodness me, people will be queuing up to come and join you. Mm-hmm. So for me, it's win-win. And so that would be my takeaway. Know it exists, don't deny it, and get on with it.
Love it. And a takeaway that I had from listening to you is, build bridges. Yeah. It's interesting that you said, this has been identified for a long time. This is not new, but we're just beginning to realize that we need to come together to address this, to be complete in our approach.
Yes.
Well, Jonathan, I can't thank you enough for such a thoughtful and enlightening conversation today. Your insights really highlight the importance of this sort of whole person approach. But beyond that, I think you've given us a lot of concrete examples and ways to think about this that we can all take back to our workplaces and use to kind of examine our next steps. For our listeners, if you're interested in learning more about workplace options and how we support organization, you can visit our website, workplaceoptions.com, or you can email us directly at wpoglobalconsulting@workplaceoptions.com. Until next time in our next podcast, take care and be well.